Welcome to the Fearless Church podcast. Thanks for joining us as we wrap up our Don't Give Up message series. This week, we finished this message series on the topic of sex. Sexual intimacy is often a hard subject to talk about, and it can be a challenging area for relationships. But we can't give up on sex because it plays a critical role in connecting spouses together. Whether you're single or married, sexually fulfilled or unfulfilled, our executive pastor, Andy Hahn, gives us some straight talk about God's intention for sex and practical tips to help you build deeper intimacy. Parents, we trust you to make a wise decision about the age, stage, and readiness for your kids to hear this PG-13 message.
We're glad you're here. Hey, if you're watching today online, so glad to have you tuning in. You've joined us on a great Sunday. We're finishing up our 4-part teaching series called Don't Give Up. And we have been talking all about God's ultimate design and intent for marriage, as well as giving some practical tools for building stronger relationships overall. And we do recognize from the very beginning that while we are talking about marriage, we are talking to a diverse audience. Some of you are certainly happily married. Some of you maybe are less happily married. Some of you are happily single. Some of you are very unhappily single. Some of you are single, you're divorced, you're widowed, you're remarried. Listen, whatever your relationship status is, we are convinced that there is something to draw from for everyone as we talk about not giving up on marriage. And I think it's true again today. Now, certainly I'm biased, but I think as we wrap up, we get to cover the best subject in the series. And it's no secret, we've talked about it. Today, we're talking about not giving up on sex. Today we get to talk about sex. Some of you, depending a little bit on your background, maybe your heritage, maybe you're already concerned that I've said the word sex this many times. Spoiler, there's going to be more. Others of you in the room, you're like, man, seriously, we have free coffee, right? We got Bill's donut holes, and we're going to talk about sex on Sunday. This is like the best church ever, right? But then there's a whole batch of you. And you're thinking, I'm not sure how I feel about the subject just yet. And here's why. Because when we talk about sex, it actually can be a very challenging topic for many couples, many relationships. And it can be a very difficult and even sore subject in the context of marriage. Now, no matter where you come from, I know sex is a compelling subject. And I also know it's one that we have to talk about. We need to talk about it. But I know this is true. Sex can be difficult to talk about. Sex is one of those things, it's very sensitive because it is so personal. And anytime there's a subject that's personal, it feels very private. And so we don't talk about it often in large groups. We don't even talk about it in small groups, many times not in our families or one-to-one. And then on top of all of that, sex just has this stigma also of just being flat out awkward and uncomfortable, right? I still remember back to elementary school days. Some of you remember this. We had a sex education seminar. Kind of came out of nowhere. I don't know if that's how it works today, but back in my day, man, we got called in, we had this special meeting, and there's somebody up front, and they start saying things that I didn't know you could say out loud. And they started putting pictures up, right? Pictures that I can't unsee. And then they started asking questions, as though a mixed group of boys and girls are about to respond to this. Everybody just ducks their head. They're praying to God, oh, please don't let them call on me. Whatever they do, don't call my name. It was so awkward. Some of you had that moment with your parents, right? Mom or dad or somebody came to you and said, hey, it's time to have the talk, right? The very fact that we call it the talk, right? It's like Voldemort. You don't even name it out loud. Don't say it. It's like, don't say it. It's just the talk, right? And there's something about birds or bees, and you all got lost in the conversation, and you were just glad when it was over, and everybody just kind of slinked away. And now the joke's on you because you're a parent. And you thought it was rough to be on the other side of that, and now you're the mom or the dad, and you're like, oh, I got to have this conversation with my kids, right? I've got 2 kids. They're in high school. They refuse to be in the room today. My mom is watching online. Hi, Mom. So listen, when it comes to awkwardness, we're all in the bus together, all right? All right? Sex is difficult to talk about. But because it's difficult to talk about, we don't talk about it. And because we don't talk about it, here's what happens. Many people walk into relationships unprepared. when it comes to sex. And couples walk into marriage unprepared when it comes to sex. Actually, I think there's a better way to say it. We're not only unprepared, we are misprepared. Couples are often misprepared when it comes to sex. In other words, we are prepared, but we're often prepared in the wrong way. See, many times we may not be having these healthy, open, honest dialogues about sex, but we are talking about it every day in certain ways. People are preparing us. Culture is preparing us with something. We've got media all around us, and we watch it in the movies. We certainly hear it in our music. We see it in our social media. Advertisements everywhere are barraging us with a sexual culture. We've got pornography that is so readily available for all of us in our hands every day, right? We have blatant and subtle ways where our views, our beliefs, our hopes, our expectations about sex, they're being shaped. And my fear is that through all of that, many times we're being misprepared. And here's why. Because here's what I see every day. Example after example of every person who is satisfied. Apparently everyone is satisfied. Everyone else seems to be having this fun, creative, romantic, regular, spontaneous sexual encounters anytime and every time. Have you ever noticed that? And you carry that into your relationships, and you carry it into your marriage, and you start thinking, hey, it's all going to be great, it's all going to be easy, and it's all just going to work. And then it doesn't just all work. In fact, there are disconnects that show up in the relationship, disconnects that show up in the marriage, and what you don't feel always is satisfaction. And so on a day like today, we start talking about sex, and it's not that you feel satisfaction. No, you feel frustration, or you feel disappointment, hurt, anger, isolation, loneliness. There's temptation, right? Even resentment. Listen, this area of marriage, it's a real personal and sensitive subject for many couples. And if you're challenged in this area of your marriage, if you have some disconnects, you are not alone. You are not alone. And I would start by saying this: rest assured, that is not what God intends for you. God does not want you or I to be disconnected in a sexual way from our spouse. And that is why we're talking about this subject, because even though this is a difficult subject, we cannot give up on sex in the way that God has designed it to be. In the way that God has designed it to be. God has an incredible purpose and design for sex in marriages. And we would never want to settle for less than what God is offering us. And so tune in. There is some great news for you today. And if you're a student in the room and you're wondering how you showed up here right now, if you're a student, I'm going to say tune in, because listen up. You've got a lot of life ahead of you. Listen, if you're not married and you're in the room today, I want you to listen up, because you're going to have to navigate this culture that we live in and the complexities of this subject every day. And if you are married, boy, certainly tune in, because I want you to live your best married life. And God never wants you or I to be uninformed, misinformed, unprepared, misprepared, and certainly not in this critical area. God needs us to understand, and he wants us to reclaim this true purpose for sex. And the big idea is simply this today: God did design sex, and he designed it to be a powerful and pleasurable point of connection in a marriage. That's what God built. God has a very healthy, very positive view of sexual intimacy, and it starts right here, this word, connection. Sex, from a biblical standpoint, is about connection in a marriage. We're going to look back at the earliest account, Genesis chapter 2, God's time of creation. We've looked at this, I think, almost every week in this series, looking back the original of God's intent. It says that a man leaves his father and mother and is united to his wife, and it says that they become one flesh. United means to be joined. They are bonded together into this thing called one flesh. And we think of that and we hear it at weddings, but we fail to recognize that an important part of being united and being bonded is sexual union. It is the sexual union that actually puts a husband and wife in this connection, in this intense form of intimate relationship. Genesis chapter 4, we read these words: Adam knew his wife Eve. Now that is the PG version. You read other translations, it might say Adam lay with his wife Eve. Yeah, we're getting closer. Then it says Adam was intimate with his wife Eve. But the real word, the Hebrew word that goes into this right here, knew, is the word intercourse. That's the word. Adam had intercourse with his wife Eve. And the word intercourse, you know what it means? It means to know. It means to know another person. Thorough, exhaustive knowledge, total sharing in every area of life. That's what they say. Adam and Eve knew each other. There was an intercourse. There was a connection in a deep, physical, real way. And I say that because it's important to note, Adam and Eve, they were connected, but they didn't just feel connected, all right? Adam and Eve didn't feel connected. They were connected. They were joined. When the Bible talks about this idea of being joined together, this idea of sexual union, it's not a feeling. It's not a feeling. Sex is not about infatuation. Sex is not just about romance. It's not necessarily the warm, fuzzy feelings you might get from it. No, the one flesh connection is more than a feeling. It is something real. Through that kind of a union, there is an actual real, tangible, almost mysterious, spiritual, I can get it right, connection between a man and a woman, bonded together. And God reiterates that point of connection throughout Scripture. In the New Testament, the Apostle Paul, one of the most famous writers of the New Testament, he speaks to the church in the city of Corinth. Corinth was a cosmopolitan city. It was a sexually charged city. The city of Corinth had a big temple there, and there's all kinds of different options for worship. And they actually had prostitutes in the area that became part of their worship experience. And this new church that had cropped up in the city of Corinth is having to deal with this kind of culture. And Paul is saying, hey, I don't want you to be blind and naive to what's happening. And so Paul said, hey, I want you to avoid sexual immorality, but he tells the Jesus followers, hey, don't connect with the prostitutes like other people are doing, but listen to why he says that. He says, do you not know that he who unites himself, there's that word again, unites himself with a prostitute is one with her in body? It's a rhetorical question. Do you not understand the depth and the weight of what is happening in this moment of sexual union? You are uniting yourself with someone. Then he goes back to God's original intent. He says the two, they become one flesh. Listen, contrary to popular belief, there is no such thing as casual sex. There isn't. Now, sex at times may feel casual. You may even think it's casual, but it's not casual. You know why? Because it does something. It does something real. It joins two people together. You can never compartmentalize sex as kind of a simple, inconsequential, physical act. It is so much more than that. It is so much more powerful than that. It is not a feeling. It does something. In God's design, it connects two people together. It bonds them. Listen, sex is designed to be that powerful. It is designed to be that powerful. And it's a point of connection within a marriage. Now, we're going to talk about pleasure in a minute, but before I do that, I do want to say a few words about this right here, this idea of within a marriage. Listen, when we understand the power that sex holds and how God built it, I think it helps us to better understand why God would desire that we would practice sex within the confines of a covenant marriage. And I realize I might be speaking now again to students in the room or singles or people who are kind of in these relationships, but you need to understand this. God's design for sex, what it really does, when we understand it, it helps us. It helps us. Physical intimacy is designed by God to be expressed within a marriage, not because sex is wrong, but because sex is powerful. I want to say that again. Physical intimacy, it's designed by God to be expressed within a marriage, not because sex is wrong, but it's because sex is that powerful. So reserving sex for marriage, it is not God's way of stifling you. It's not God's way of repressing you. It's not God's way of punishing you or controlling you. It is God's heart for protecting you. That is what God is doing. If you're not married in the room today, God's chief point in all of this, when we talk about sexual union, is protection of you, protection of your body. But by protecting your body, he's protecting your mind. He's protecting your heart. Because if you connect with someone sexually in a way that is premature, you may pay the price. Listen, I see a lot of couples, and some of the most painful relational breakups, some of the most difficult relational and emotional baggage that gets carried on in life, it's the product. It's the product of two people trying to separate what has been bonded together in a sexual way when they were never committed to a lifelong relationship. I'll say it even a different way. Sex is a life-uniting act. That's what it is. Sex is a life-uniting act. And the way we protect that, the way you guard your heart in that is through a life-uniting commitment. And that's what marriage is. It is saying, come heck or high water, I am with you for life. I will go nowhere. And in the safety of that kind of commitment, that life-uniting commitment, is when and where God says, absolutely exercise that life-uniting act. Sex needs to be protected because it's powerful. Reserving it for marriage, it's not punitive. It's protective. And that's why God cares about his people and their hearts. So Paul says, flee from that. Flee from that. God has designed sex to be powerful and pleasurable point of connection within a marriage. So sex is powerful. But more than that, that's just part of the equation. Sex is pleasurable. Silence. No one has the moxie, right? No one has the moxie to yell amen. Everybody's wanting to. Listen, there are people at home right now just going crazy. You're watching online. You already quit this. Actually, you left. All right. So, sex is a pleasurable means of connection in a marriage, right? It is. It is. Sex is meant to be a source of pleasure for you. What that means is God grants you freedom. Freedom to fully and physically enjoy your spouse. Look at this. It says, let your wife, Proverbs 5, let your wife be a fountain of blessing for you. Let her body satisfy you always. Always. Technical word means always, all the time. And right here, I put this right here. Let her body satisfy you always. He's talking about physical pleasure, physical freedom. I put this in quotes right here because if you looked in your text, you may not see the word body. You'd see a body part because that's how graphic God wants to share with us. Find pleasure, find the freedom in your marriage. And it says, may you always be captivated by her love. The word captivated, intoxicated, almost a sense of drunkenness and excitement and exhilaration. Listen, men, I realize this is really aiming at you, and you may have never done scripture memory. If you've never done that, here's 2 verses, right? I've never been brave enough to think about getting a tattoo, right? Because I just don't know what I'd want to put on my body for that long. This might work. It might work, right? Listen, there's freedom and excitement. There's poetic writing in the Old Testament. Solomon, the wisest man ever to live, God uses him to write wisdom literature. He writes something called Song of Solomon. Read through Song of Solomon. It is an expression of sexual freedom. Solomon paints this picture of a bride and a groom, describing in glowing terms each other's physical bodies. That's what he does. He talks about gazelles and pomegranates and mountains of myrrh and spiced valleys. Those are metaphors if you haven't caught on, right? He doesn't really care about fruit and topography and all of that. He's making the point, not to be graphic, but he's saying God speaks openly about the pleasure and joy of sex in your marriage. God makes it clear throughout Scripture, you have freedom. You have freedom to express your love relationally, emotionally, physically, one to another. I'll say it in a different way very plainly. Sex is not unspiritual. Sex is not unspiritual. And there are some of you here, this may be the only thing you need to hear today. Sex is not unspiritual, and you need to understand, sex is not something that we are to be ashamed of. Sex is never something that we are supposed to be afraid of or embarrassed about. Listen, God has hardwired us to have sexual desires. That is woven into his creation. God made us in his image, and we are designed as sexual beings. And because of that, we can embrace sexuality, we can be thankful for it, we can enjoy it. But I say this because there are some of you here, depending on your background, maybe you've been taught that sex is unspiritual. And maybe you've been taught somehow that it's indecent. Maybe you were raised in a home where what you heard was wait until you're married, wait until you're married, wait until you're married. But that wasn't out of protection. It turned into wait until you're married because sex is wrong. Sex is dirty. Somehow sex is filthy. And maybe that's what you carry in your heart. Maybe you've been taught that sex is unspiritual, or maybe you simply feel the weight of it and you feel there's an indecency to it somehow, even as you start to think or talk about it. And if that's you today, there's a good chance that is having a ripple effect into your relationship, into your marriage. Listen, if that's you, if you walk into marriage and you think sex is somehow unspiritual, you will naturally be restrained and you will be inhibited and you will never fully open up to your husband or your wife in the way that God might allow you to do. And you might feel ashamed of your desires when they show up. You may even be ashamed of the actions that you are participating in your marriage. And in that, you will feel a lack of joy and a lack of freedom. Listen, I see couple after couple, and they're trying to live out Christ-centered marriages. but they get restricted in this area. They get held back because they are beholden many times to a corrupted view of sex that they've brought with them. Listen, look back to Paul in the New Testament. Paul back in the New Testament again, he says outside of marriage, he talks to the church, he says outside of marriage, hey, abstain. Why? For your protection. But inside of marriage, he says, do the exact opposite. And so after he's done giving instructions to the people who are not married, he says this to the people that are married. He says, husbands, fulfill your marital duty to your wife. Wives, do the same. The wife to her husband. He's talking about sexual union now. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but yields it to her husband. He encourages wives to give themselves freely, physically to their husbands. And he says the exact same thing. Husbands, you don't have authority over your body. You need to yield it, offer it freely to your wives. And listen to this. He says, don't deprive each other, except perhaps by mutual consent and for a time, so that you may devote yourselves to prayer. Some of you read that, maybe you read it for the first time, you're like, hang on, what I read here is like, so just keep having sex all the time unless for some reason we agree to stop and pray? You can read it that way, all right? You get the idea. You get the idea, right? And again, I'm not trying to make fun of it. I'm trying to say sex is not something we have to do. It is something we get to do. And it's not even just something that you get to do. It's actually something you get to enjoy. God designed it to be a pleasurable point of connection, not a necessary one only, a pleasurable one. It is a gift. Sex is not unspiritual. And within a marriage, within a God-honoring marriage, sex can be passionate, can be uninhibited, it can be unrestrained, creative, fun, and life-giving. Listen, God designed sex to be pleasurable, powerful point of connection in a marriage. And if you want to experience deep intimacy in your marriage, you want to get connected, you want to stay connected for the long haul, I'd encourage you, don't give up on sex. Don't give up on sex. And I'm not talking about giving up on the idea of sex in theory. I'm saying, no, don't give up on the idea of having a connected, satisfying sexual relationship with your spouse and what that looks like for you. Now, some of you are still reeling that we're actually talking about sex in church. Some of you are thinking, okay, I'm with you, I'm convinced. In fact, I was never going to give up. I don't know who would ever give up on that. And you're hearing what God describes and you're thinking to yourself, that sounds great. But here's the real problem, right? It sounds too great. Quite frankly, for many couples, this feels ideal. Almost unrealistic, because I see many couples that don't see other couples experiencing sex in the way that God is talking about it, but also they're not currently experiencing that in their marriage. And you may not be experiencing that in your marriage. And I said we'd come back to this. The truth is this: intimacy can be a very difficult area for many, many couples. There are so many things that can break and disconnect us when it comes to intimacy. Some of you are still dealing with past relationship issues. Some of you have had some very difficult past experiences in your life. You might just have physical health challenges. You might have hormone changes. You might have aging that's happening. That's not even the rest of life, right? Like you've got the busyness of your career, your calendar, demands of work. If you've had kids, right? Maybe you've got kids and you recognize kids never help your sex life, ever. That's not even including the differences that happen in the bedroom. You and your spouse agreeing or disagreeing on what's appropriate or maybe inappropriate. Maybe there's some body image issues or struggles with insecurity. You might just have flat out different levels of interest regarding sex. Listen, intimacy is a challenge for so many reasons. And if you have disconnects in this area, you are part of the vast majority of people and the vast majority of couples who have had to do the hard work of figuring out how to step forward in your sexual intimacy. And so as we wrap up today, I want to help you just that. I want to answer that question: where do we go from here? Where do we go from here? How do you step forward? How do you find a more satisfying sexual connection with your spouse? Taking a step in the right direction. And so as we do that today, I'm going to give you a starting point. It's not a finish line. Like these last 10 minutes, they're not the finish line. I know that. It's not a magic silver bullet of any kind that will solve everything for you. But it will give you some practical ideas to get things moving in a better direction. And we're going to finish where we started, all right? We're going to start with pro tips. I'm not bringing John Silfies out. 3 real pro tips to help improve sexual intimacy in your marriage. Here's pro tip number 1. You want to improve things in your bedroom? You need to start talking about them outside the bedroom. A healthier sex life begins by talking more about sexual intimacy with your spouse. Said earlier, it's difficult to talk about, and one of the reasons that we're unprepared or misprepared or disconnected when it comes to intimacy is that we don't often do the difficult work of talking about intimacy in our marriages, and you need to do that work. It's hard, but you have to start talking about sex in your context, with your spouse, with your personalities, with your family background, with your experiences, and maybe as a couple, you've never sat down and said, hey, I want to express some expectations. And it's time to start talking maybe about those expectations. Or maybe you never sat down and said, hey, can we talk about assumptions that I brought with me? And you talk through those assumptions. Some of you need to start talking a little bit about your desires. And maybe for the first time, verbalize some preferences, some likes, some dislikes, some hopes, some wants, some needs that you have. Take that step to talk more openly. And it's not just a one-time conversation. Again, it's not now like trying to have the talk with your spouse. It's creating it to be part of an ongoing conversation. We talk about so many things in our marriage freely, right? We talk about work all the time. We talk about money. We talk about conflict. We talk about communication. Like we dialogue around those things. We talk parenting all the time, incessantly talking about our kids. And I often wonder, why is it we don't talk about sexual intimacy as a regular occurring part of our relationships when it is every bit, if not more critical than those other areas? Start talking about sex in your relationships. Now again, it's hard to do. And it may be a taboo subject for you. I realize that. It may be a sore subject for you, and I know that, so I would say this: be thoughtful and be very intentional when you start talking about sex. Be thoughtful and intentional. Whatever you can do, get yourself into the best position possible to have a healthy conversation. Find the right time, find the right place to talk about sex, right? Don't start talking about sex when your kids are running around. Don't talk about sex when you have to talk in a hushed voice and hurry through that. Don't talk about sex 5 minutes before someone's leaving for work. Don't talk about sex after you lay your head down at night and you're tired and you're going to sleep. Never talk about sex when you're frustrated or angry with each other. Like, that is not the time to do it. And some of you are thinking, what other time is there? You may have to schedule it. And I don't mean sex, although that's a different subject that probably would actually be very helpful. But talk about scheduling conversations around this subject. Say, every week, let's take 10 minutes. I know it sounds weird, right? Let's take 10 minutes on Saturday. That's going to be our time. We're going to talk about intimacy. How do we do this week? What are we working on? What's happening? You've got to talk about it. You've got to be intentional. You've got to start the conversation. And if I've done nothing else today, at least I've done this. I've given you the grounds to start talking about it. And you can blame me all you want. Be like, hey, that guy on stage said I'm supposed to talk about sex, so I'm starting the conversation. I'm starting it today. Listen, you want to improve things outside the bedroom. This is where it starts. It starts by talking about sex. Pro tip number 2 is this: find yourself a helpful resource. Find a helpful resource. And here's the truth: if you do pro tip number 2, it's actually going to be very, very helpful for pro tip number 1. One of the challenges of talking about sex is you don't know where to start. You don't know how to wade into the conversation. When you find a resource, it will help have tracks to run on. It will give you an ongoing place to start. Things that you may not want to wade into will be spoken for you, and you can use those. So for example, get a book. Get a book. You may not be aware. There are a lot of very helpful, very candid, practical resources that can help you employ godly principles, and books are one of them. We've got a book called Sheet Music. That's just one book. Sheet Music by Kevin Lehman. We use it. My wife and I have it. I've read it. We use it with younger couples. Why? Because it's a comprehensive manual on all things sexual intimacy, and no subject is left untouched. You get a book like that, and what you can do with each other is say, hey, let's read a chapter. And then next week, we're going to talk about that. Gives you tracks to run on. There's a subject that I would have never figured out how to broach over breakfast, right? Well, chapter 3, let's talk about it. Use that book as a guideline. It's a great resource. Maybe you're not a book person. You're like, I don't want to read anything. That's okay. There are online resources available. You may not be aware of that either. There are people all over the country, men and women, who are experts in this area, right? The joke was made in week 1 that I'm somehow a sexpert in this subject. That's not fully true. I did make some business cards, but there are, I just play one on TV, right? But they're good at this. And if you go online and find these resources, and there are subscriptions, and some of the content is free, others you actually subscribe for, and they provide all kinds of things, webinars and seminars and talking points, and they dialogue with experts and things like that. They provide all the conversation questions, the conversation starters. It's like sitting in a sexual intimacy workshop in the safety of your own home anytime you want. And again, if you want that resource, talk to me. I've got some names for you. There are things available to assist you in this area. There are great resources. And maybe, just maybe, you need to take one step further. Maybe this has been a battle for you for a long time. Maybe you need to find a counselor. Maybe you need to find a qualified therapist, someone that with wisdom and with care can help you navigate that conversation and move you forward in your marriage. Don't ever be afraid. Don't ever be afraid to go out and find a helpful resource. And here's the last thing, and we'll finish with this. Pro tip number 3. When it comes to building healthier sexual intimacy, do your part. Do your part. This is one of those areas it can be easy to point the finger, and it's never helpful. And as much as you may want to, you might say, boy, if she would just be this, or if she would just think that, or be willing to this. Or if he were just more like this or more like that, or if he would say this or this or this, right? It's easy to point the finger and think that the whole issue here is to solve it. If your husband would do this, if your wife would do this, listen, do the hard work of looking in the mirror and owning your part. Do some self-evaluation here, some self-awareness. Identify how your beliefs, your personal beliefs, your desires, your action, maybe your inaction are affecting your spouse and your sexual intimacy. Right? Don't walk into this, like as you leave today, don't walk into this with a sense of I'm going to manipulate my spouse or push them in a certain direction to a certain outcome. No, look in the mirror and figure out how in a humble, receiving way you can learn about what your part is in contributing to a healthy sex life. Ask your spouse, what 1 or 2 things can I do to serve you in this area? That's a great place to start. Not how can you serve me? How can I serve you? What 1 or 2 things, right? Is there something I can do that would initiate differently? Is there something I can do that would help respond better? Is there something I can do to help build intimacy emotionally, relationally? Like, what is it? What can I do to serve you in this area? And then be committed to doing it. Step out together and be optimistic. Be optimistic. I'm encouraged in this, that I know God wants to have sex be a pleasurable and powerful point of connection in marriages. He built it that way for a reason. And so as you step forward, find that optimism again, no matter where you are in this process, to say, honey, husband, wife, whoever you are, let's do this together. Let's build a stronger marriage in this area. And it starts by talking about it, finding a resource, and committing to do your part. So, don't give up. Don't give up. Don't give up on marriage. Don't give up on singleness. We talked about that. Don't give up on communication. And certainly don't ever give up on sex.
Thanks again for tuning in with us today. At Fearless Church, we believe that every message is a chance for us to take new ground in our walks with Jesus. To help you in that direction, we have some discussion questions in our podcast notes that you can think through on your own, or even better, talk through with some friends, a family member, or a spouse. In those notes, we also have included information on our service times and location, as well as what you need to know about our precautions for COVID-19. We hope you will join us again soon on the Fearless Church podcast.